The year was 2008, and the financial world was burning. If you walked through the streets of Lower Manhattan in September of that year, you would have seen men and women in expensive suits walking out of skyscrapers carrying cardboard boxes. They were not just losing their jobs. They were witnessing the collapse of the illusion that held the global economy together. Lehman Brothers had fallen. The housing market was crumbling. The banks that people trusted with their life savings were revealed to be reckless gamblers playing with money that did not belong to them. Governments around the world scrambled to fix the damage. Their solution was simple: print more money, bail out the failures, dilute the savings of the working class to save the institutions that caused the problem. It was a cycle that had repeated throughout history. But while the world focused on the loud chaos of Wall Street, a quiet revolution was beginning in the dark corners of the internet. On October 31st, 2008, a person, or perhaps a group of people operating under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto, published a white paper. It was only 9 pages long. It had a dry technical title: Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. There was no press conference. There was no marketing budget. There was no CEO. Just a link sent to a cryptography mailing list. Most people ignored it, but for a small group of coders and libertarians, this was the holy grail they had been waiting for. It was a way to transfer value between two people anywhere in the world without asking for permission from a bank or a government. This is the story of how a few lines of code grew from a worthless experiment into a trillion-dollar asset that challenged the oldest empires of finance. This is the story of the rise of Bitcoin. To understand why Bitcoin matters, you first have to unlearn everything you think you know about money. We grow up believing that money is real. We think of the paper in our wallets or the digits in our bank accounts as solid, unchanging things. But money is not a thing. Money is a system of trust. When you hold a US dollar or a euro, you are holding a promise. You trust that the government will not print so much of it that it becomes worthless. You trust that the bank will give it to you when you ask for it. You trust that the system will work. Throughout history, that trust has been broken time and time again. From the clipped coins of the Roman Empire, to the hyperinflation of Weimar Germany, to the banking collapse of 2008. Whenever humans control the supply of money, they eventually yield to the temptation to create more of it. It is politically easier to print money than it is to tax citizens. Satoshi Nakamoto looked at this history of failure and asked a radical question. What if we could create a form of money that required no trust in humans? What if the rules were set in stone not by politicians, but by mathematics? This is the core innovation of Bitcoin. It is not just digital currency. We already had digital currency. When you swipe your credit card, you are using digital currency. The problem with the old system was the middleman. You needed a bank to verify that you actually had the money. Satoshi solved this with something called the blockchain. Imagine a giant glass notebook floating in the sky. Everyone in the world can see this notebook. Every time someone sends money to someone else, a line is written in this notebook. Alice sends Bob 5 coins. Bob sends Charlie 2 coins. Because everyone has a copy of this notebook and everyone is watching it, nobody can cheat. If Alice tries to send money, she does not have the entire network sees the error and rejects it. There is no bank manager to bribe. There is no server to hack. There is no government that can seize the notebook because the notebook exists on thousands of computers all over the world simultaneously. This was the invention of absolute scarcity in the digital realm. Before Bitcoin, anything digital could be copied. If you have a digital photo, you can email it to a friend, and now you both have the photo. That works for images, but it is terrible for money. If you can copy your money, it becomes worthless. Bitcoin was the first digital object that could not be copied. If I send you a Bitcoin, I no longer have it. It is as physical as a gold bar, but it moves at the speed of light. But in the beginning, it was worthless. For the first year of its existence, Bitcoin had no price. It was simply a hobby for computer geeks. They mined it on their laptops. They sent it back and forth to test the network. It was a game. Satoshi Nakamoto was still active in those days, chatting on forums and refining the code. He or she mined over 1 million Bitcoin in those early days. Those coins have never moved. They sit in the blockchain like a buried treasure waiting for a ghost to return. Then came the moment that turned the code into a currency. May 22, 2010. A programmer named Laszlo Hanyecz made a post on a forum. He offered 10,000 Bitcoin to anyone who would order him 2 pizzas. At the time, 10,000 Bitcoin was just a random number. It meant nothing. But a British user took him up on the offer. He ordered 2 Papa John pizzas for Laszlo, and in exchange Laszlo sent him the coins. It was the first time in history that Bitcoin was exchanged for a real-world good. That transaction gave Bitcoin a price. 2 pizzas were worth about $40. So 10,000 Bitcoin was worth $40. The price of a single Bitcoin was less than half a penny. If you had bought $10 worth of Bitcoin that day, you would be a billionaire today. But nobody knew that then. They just saw a cool new technology. As Bitcoin began to grow, it attracted a different crowd. The idealists were joined by the opportunists and the outlaws. If you create a form of money that cannot be censored, it will inevitably be used by people who have been censored by the traditional system. Enter the Silk Road. In 2011, a darknet market launched. It was an Amazon for illegal goods. Drugs, fake passports, weapons. You could buy anything on the Silk Road, and you could pay for it with Bitcoin. For the media, this was the perfect narrative. Bitcoin was not a financial revolution. It was money for criminals. It was dangerous. Senators demanded it be banned. But underneath the hysteria, something profound was being proven. Bitcoin worked. It worked under the most hostile conditions imaginable. The most powerful governments in the world wanted to stop these transactions, but they could not. They could arrest the people running the illegal websites, but they could not stop the Bitcoin network itself. This proved that Bitcoin was censorship resistant. It was a neutral tool like a hammer or a knife. A hammer can be used to build a house or to hurt someone. The hammer does not care. Bitcoin does not care who you are or what you are buying. It simply executes the code. While the Silk Road brought notoriety, it also brought value. The price began to climb. It went from pennies to $1, then to $10, then to $30. People began to realize that this was the only asset in the world that could not be confiscated by a border guard or frozen by a bank. But with value comes greed. And with greed comes danger. The early years of Bitcoin were the Wild West. There were no regulations. There were no insured banks. If you wanted to buy Bitcoin, you had to wire money to shady exchanges run by amateur coders. The biggest of them all was Mt. Gox. Based in Tokyo, Mt. Gox handled over 70% of all Bitcoin transactions in the world. It was the beating heart of the economy. But in 2014, the heart stopped beating. The exchange went offline. Rumors swirled. Then the devastating truth came out. Mt. Gox had been hacked. 850,000 Bitcoins were gone. They had been stolen slowly over years without anyone noticing. The price of Bitcoin crashed. It lost 80% of its value. The media wrote their obituaries. They cheered the death of Bitcoin. They called it a Ponzi scheme. They said the experiment was over. And honestly, it should have been over. In the traditional financial world, if the biggest bank collapses, the currency usually dies with it. But Bitcoin is not traditional finance. Bitcoin did not die because Bitcoin was not Mt. Gox. Mt. Gox was just a company built on top of Bitcoin. The protocol itself had not been hacked. The blockchain was still secure. The blocks kept being produced every 10 minutes like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Those who survived the crash learned a valuable lesson. Not your keys, not your coins. If you leave your Bitcoin on an exchange, you do not own it. You only own an IOU. To truly own Bitcoin, you must hold the private keys yourself. This is a level of responsibility that most modern people are not used to. We are used to safety nets. We are used to passwords resets. In Bitcoin, there is no customer support. If you lose your password, your money is gone forever. It is the price of total sovereignty. From the ashes of 2014, a new narrative began to emerge. The price stayed low for years, but the development did not stop. Engineers kept building. The network became stronger, and the world around Bitcoin began to change. We entered an era of negative interest rates. Central banks in Europe and Japan were punishing people for saving money. They wanted you to spend. They wanted to inflate the debt away. Smart investors began looking for a life raft. They looked at gold, which had served this purpose for 5,000 years. Gold is valuable because it is scarce. You cannot print gold. You have to dig it out of the ground, which takes energy and time. Then they looked at Bitcoin. They realized that Bitcoin was not just digital cash. It was digital gold. But it was better than gold. Gold is heavy. It is hard to transport. If you want to move $1 billion of gold, you need a ship and an army to protect it. You can move $1 billion of Bitcoin by memorizing 12 words in your head. You can cross any border naked and still carry your entire fortune with you. Furthermore, the supply of gold is not fixed. If the price of gold goes up, miners will develop better technology to dig up more of it. The supply increases to meet the demand. Bitcoin is different. The supply is mathematically fixed. There will never be more than 21 million Bitcoin. This number is hard-coded into the software. It is protected by thousands of computers. To change it, you would have to convince the entire network to devalue their own money, which will never happen. This creates a property known as absolute scarcity. It is the only thing in the known universe with a strictly limited supply. Every 4 years, an event happens called the halving. The reward that miners get for securing the network is cut in half. In the beginning, they got 50 Bitcoins every 10 minutes, then 25, then 12.5. This creates a supply shock. Just as demand is growing, the amount of new supply is shrinking. In 2017, this mechanic triggered a mania. Bitcoin broke through $1,000, then $5,000, then $10,000. It became a cultural phenomenon. Grandmothers were asking how to buy it. Taxi drivers were giving stock tips. It was a bubble, of course. And like all bubbles, it popped. After reaching nearly $20,000 in December 2017, the price crashed down to $3,000. Once again, the critics celebrated. They said it was a tulip mania. They said it was rat poison. But the believers stayed. They called themselves hodlers, a misspelling of the word hold that became a battle cry. They were not here for the quick profits. They were here for the revolution. They believed that eventually the fiat money system would break. They believed that the constant printing of money by governments was unsustainable. They viewed Bitcoin as insurance against the stupidity of politicians. And then came 2020. The COVID pandemic shut down the world. The global economy came to a screeching halt. Governments panicked. They did the only thing they knew how to do. They printed money. Trillions of dollars were created out of thin air in a matter of months. Theoretically, this money was meant to help people. But in reality, much of it flowed into financial assets, making the rich richer, while inflation began to eat away at the grocery bills of the poor. This was the moment Bitcoin was built for. Paul Tudor Jones, one of the most legendary hedge fund managers in history, came out and said he was buying Bitcoin. He called it the fastest horse in the race against inflation. Then came Michael Saylor, the CEO of a boring software company called MicroStrategy. He looked at his company's cash reserves and realized that the dollars were melting like ice cubes. He decided to convert his company's treasury into Bitcoin. It was a bet that shocked Wall Street. But it worked. Tesla bought Bitcoin. Insurance companies bought Bitcoin. The narrative had shifted completely. It was no longer money for drug dealers. It was a pristine collateral asset for the sophisticated investor. But the biggest shock came from a small country in Central America, El Salvador. For decades, El Salvador had been dependent on the US dollar. They had no control over their own monetary policy. In 2021, President Nayib Bukele announced that Bitcoin would become legal tender. It was the first time a nation-state recognized Bitcoin as real money. McDonald's in El Salvador had to accept it. Starbucks had to accept it. The government built a wallet called Chivo and gave $30 of Bitcoin to every citizen. The IMF was furious. The World Bank issued warnings. They told El Salvador that their economy would collapse. It was a volatile experiment, but it signaled something massive. The separation of money and state. For thousands of years, the state has controlled the money. Kings stamped their faces on coins. Central banks printed notes. Bitcoin suggests that money does not need the state. It suggests that money is a language that we can use to communicate value to one another without a master overseeing the conversation. So where does that leave us today? We're standing at a crossroads. On one side, we have the traditional financial system. It is centralized. It is controlled by a few powerful people. It is prone to inflation and censorship, but it is familiar. It is what we know. On the other side, we have Bitcoin. It is decentralized. It is volatile. It is chaotic, but it is free. Critics will point to the energy usage. They say Bitcoin boils the oceans. It is true that Bitcoin uses a lot of energy, but that energy is not wasted. It is used to secure the network. It creates a wall of energy that protects the ledger from being rewritten. Furthermore, Bitcoin miners are increasingly becoming the buyers of last resort for renewable energy. They set up operations next to hydroelectric dams and wind farms using excess power that would otherwise be wasted. They are incentivizing the build-out of green grids by providing a constant buyer for electricity. Other critics say it has no intrinsic value. They say you cannot eat a Bitcoin. You cannot live in a Bitcoin. But what is the intrinsic value of a dollar bill? It is a piece of cotton blend paper. Its value comes only from our collective belief. Gold has some industrial use, but the vast majority of its value comes from its role as a store of wealth. Bitcoin is pure monetary energy. Its value comes from its network effect, from the millions of people who have agreed that this is the standard. The rise of Bitcoin is not just a story about technology. It is a story about human psychology. It asks us to trust in code rather than infallible leaders. It asks us to take responsibility for our own wealth. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of our current system. If our banks were honest, if our governments were responsible, if our money held its value, Bitcoin would not need to exist. But it does exist, and it is growing. The genie is out of the bottle. You can ban it, but you cannot kill it. You can tax it, but you cannot stop it. As we move further into the digital age, the idea of a non-sovereign digital money seems less like a crazy experiment and more like an inevitability. Whether Bitcoin goes to $1 million or to zero is almost beside the point. The invention has been made. The discovery that digital scarcity is possible cannot be undiscovered. We are witnessing the birth of a new asset class, a new way of organizing human cooperation. It has been a wild ride from the ashes of 2008 to the boardrooms of 2024. From a few cypherpunks trading magic internet money to nation-states, adding it to their reserves. But in many ways the story is just beginning. The blocks keep coming. Every 10 minutes. Tick-tock. Next block. The network does not sleep. It does not care about politics. It does not care about your race or your religion or your credit score. It just validates. And in a world of increasing uncertainty, perhaps that cold mathematical truth is exactly what we need. This has been the story of the rise of Bitcoin. But the real question is not what Bitcoin will do next. The question is, what will you do when you realize that the money in your pocket is melting and there is a lifeboat that has been waiting for you for 15 years? The choice, as always, is yours. To understand the future, we must look at the mechanism of the past. The history of money is the history of debasement. In ancient Rome, the denarius was once pure silver. Over centuries, the emperors needed more money to pay for wars and lavish palaces. They began to mix the silver with cheaper metals like copper. By the end of the empire, the coins were almost worthless. The soldiers refused to be paid in them. The economy collapsed. The empire fell. This pattern repeats. The French Revolution was preceded by the printing of the assignat. The paper money became so worthless that people burned it for warmth. In the 20th century, we saw it in Hungary, in Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. We like to think that the US dollar or the euro or the yen are immune to this. We think we are too smart, too advanced. But the math is the same. When a government spends more than it earns, it must fill the gap. It fills the gap by issuing debt. When there is too much debt, the central bank steps in to buy it. They buy it with newly created money. This dilutes the supply. It steals value from everyone who holds the currency. It is a hidden tax. You do not see it on your pay stub. You see it at the grocery store. You see it when a house costs 10 times what your parents paid for it. Bitcoin is the antithesis of this system. It is the first monetary system where the supply is not determined by policy, but by physics. To create a Bitcoin, you must expend energy. You must do work. This is called proof of work. It connects the digital world to the physical world. You cannot cheat the laws of thermodynamics. This is why Bitcoiners often say that Bitcoin is truth. In a world of fake news, deep fakes, and political spin, the blockchain is an anchor of objective reality. If the transaction is in the block, it happened. If it is not, it did not. There is no spin. There is no interpretation. This desire for truth is what drives the adoption. Young people today are growing up in a world where they feel the game is rigged. They see the financial system protecting the wealthy while the cost of living skyrockets. They cannot afford homes. They are drowning in student debt. They look at the stock market and see it disconnected from reality, propped up by stimulus. They look at Bitcoin and they see a level playing field. No one gets special treatment in Bitcoin. The protocol treats the billionaire and the student exactly the same. The fees are the same. The rules are the same. This fairness is intoxicating. It is a return to free market capitalism in its purest form. Not crony capitalism where the government picks winners and losers, but a system where value is determined solely by the market. Of course, the road ahead is not smooth. Governments will fight back. They do not like losing their monopoly on money. They are launching their own digital currencies, known as CBDCs or central bank digital currencies. These are the opposite of Bitcoin. They are digital, but they are centralized. They are programmable. A government could theoretically program your money so that it expires if you do not spend it, or they could prevent you from buying certain things, or they could turn off your wallet if you disagree with them. This is the battle of the 21st century. Open decentralized money versus closed centralized money. Freedom versus control. Bitcoin represents the exit door. It is the opt-out button. By holding Bitcoin, you are voting against the surveillance state. You are voting for privacy. You are voting for property rights. This is why the human rights activists are some of the strongest supporters of Bitcoin. In Nigeria, when the government froze the bank accounts of protesters fighting against police brutality, the protesters switched to Bitcoin. They kept the movement alive. In Afghanistan, when the banks shut down as the Taliban took over, women used Bitcoin to protect their savings and flee the country. In Russia and Ukraine, when the war broke out and the ATMs ran dry, people used Bitcoin to survive. This is the utility that the Wall Street analysts often miss. They look at the charts and the volatility. They do not see the lifeline. For someone in a stable democracy with a good banking system, Bitcoin might look like a speculative toy. But for the 4 billion people living under authoritarian regimes or double-digit inflation, Bitcoin is not a toy. It is a necessity. It is their only bank. It is their only hope. As the world becomes more unstable, the value of a permissionless money becomes more obvious. We are seeing the financial infrastructure of the world being weaponized. Sanctions, frozen assets, deplatforming. If you can be cut off from your money because of your nationality or your political views, then your money is not really yours. Bitcoin fixes this. It is the money of enemies. You can send Bitcoin to someone you hate, and the network will process it just the same. This neutrality is essential for a global reserve currency. For decades, the US dollar has been the global reserve. But the world is losing trust in the US. Countries like China and Russia and Saudi Arabia are looking for alternatives. They do not want to trust each other's currencies. They need something neutral, something that no one controls. Gold used to play this role. Bitcoin is the digital successor. It is the only asset that is not someone else's liability. When you own a bond, you are owed money by a government. When you own a stock, you are a shareholder in a company. When you have a bank deposit, the bank owes you cash. When you own Bitcoin, you just own Bitcoin. No one owes you anything. There is no counterparty risk. This is why it is called pristine collateral. The rise of Bitcoin has also sparked an explosion of innovation. Layer 2 solutions like the Lightning Network are making payments instant and nearly free. You can now stream money like you stream video. You can pay for a coffee with a fraction of a penny. Smart contracts are being built on top of the network. Decentralized finance is recreating banking services without the bankers. We are still in the early innings. The user interface is still clunky. It is still too hard for my grandmother to use securely. The volatility is still stomach-churning. But the trend is clear. Every year the network grows. Every year the security increases. Every year the ecosystem matures. We often overestimate what technology can do in 1 year and underestimate what it can do in 10 years. 10 years ago, Bitcoin was a joke. Today it is a geopolitical force. 10 years from now, it could be the standard. Imagine a world where money does not lose value, where you can save for your retirement without having to become an investor, where you can work and save and know that your purchasing power will be preserved. This changes the time preference of society. When money loses value rapidly, people rush to spend it. They become short-term thinkers. They consume. When money gains value, people save. They plan for the long term. They build. Bitcoin encourages low time preference. It encourages thinking about the future. This cultural shift might be the most important impact of the rise of Bitcoin. It is teaching a generation the value of patience, the value of conviction. It is a story that is still being written by millions of people around the world. Each person who runs a node, each person who mines a block, each person who stacks a Satoshi. They are the authors of this story. The rise of Bitcoin is the rise of the individual against the collective machine. It is the rise of code against decree. It is the rise of hard money in a world of easy choices. And as the old system begins to creak under the weight of its own debt, the light from the blockchain burns brighter. It is a beacon, a warning, and an invitation. The future is here. It is just unevenly distributed. And it is distributed on a ledger that cannot be erased. The story of money is changing. For the first time, we have a choice. We can stay with the system that requires us to trust fallible humans. or we can move to a system that requires us to trust verifiable math. The rise of Bitcoin is simply the market making that choice one transaction at a time. It is the sound of money finding its freedom. And once money is free, it can never be caged again.